This is an interview with Professor Geoffrey Robinson, a historian whose work focuses on mass violence, human rights, and the political history of Indonesia. After studying Indonesian history and politics, Robinson worked with Amnesty International in London, an experience that shaped his approach to history, evidence, and human rights. In this conversation, he discusses the 1965-68 Indonesian killings, visual history, social memory, and why historians need to listen to survivors as well as official records. You can read more about Professor Robinson on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy this video.
Your work often focuses on mass violence and human rights. What first drew you to studying Indonesia in the event studying the 1965 to 1968 killings?
There's a short version of it, is that right after I finished university, I'm Canadian, by the way, so I went to McGill University. Right after I did my BA, I thought I didn't really want to study law, and I didn't want to go straight to grad school. So I traveled. I traveled for about 2 years, mostly in Southeast Asia, and the place that really caught my attention was Indonesia. So, long story short, I decided to do a doctorate focusing on Indonesian history and Indonesian politics. And what I found as soon as I did that, partly because I had such amazing professors, I found that my fantasy about this place being kind of, beautiful and wonderful and harmonious were completely wrong. And that in fact, it was a place with a really horrible colonial history and a really equally horrible post-colonial history. Filled with a lot of violence, and yet what was striking to me, because I was doing my doctorate during the 1980s, basically, and it was a time when everybody was singing Indonesia's praises as a place that with rapid economic growth and so on, and nobody was talking about its the underbelly, the dark side of the country, its history and its contemporary politics, and so I kind of grew up being suspicious of very nice stories and very nice histories, and my professors were equally so. One of my professors was Benedict Anderson, famous scholar of nationalism, but who began as an Indonesian scholar. And his professor, Professor Kayan, both of them encouraged me to look into this question a little bit more deeply. And as I went along, I was just broadly interested in Indonesia, but then I dug into the story of 1965, and what was especially shocking to me was how little people remembered or how little people knew about it. And that was particularly true for some of the main kind of the places that Indonesia is famous for, like the island of Bali, which people describe as a kind of paradise island, and still do. I mean, historically, it was true and still is true. And so I was looking into that and discovered that, in fact, far from being a paradise, Bali was probably one of the places hardest hit by the mass killings of leftists in the mid-1960s. So that really piqued my interest, and I did my dissertation and first book about the violence in Bali. And then I took a bit of a left turn, or a U-turn, if you like. I left academia right after doing that doctorate and went to work with Amnesty International in London at the main office. And my background in knowing something about Indonesian history and the language and politics and so on really helped me to do that human rights work. And so that combination, the academic work and then the 5 years working in human rights policy and advocacy, and report writing, really shaped the rest of everything that I wrote ever after, which was some combination of an attention to violence and also thinking of it from the point of view of human rights law and human rights history.
Yeah, I really like the answer, especially like how you talk. Like, I think it highlights the importance of travel too, because just like a lot of like college students are just like into this, like you go to college and then you have to go to the grad school or law school, med school, and you have to get into the job market. It's just like huge thing.
Yeah.
You can't really like learn anything if you don't travel.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I think it's hard now because especially if you took up big loans to go to college in the US, there's a pressure to, get out there and earn. And my daughter is now a senior in college and she's worried about her job and so on. And I'm trying to convince her about
Where'd
what
you
you just
go?
said. She's at University of British Columbia. So
Nice.
we live in Canada now.
Mhm.
And this is a good thing in many ways because universities here cost about $5,000 a year instead of $85,000 a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So uh, anyway, so that is you're absolutely right about the travel thing. I honestly, my life would have been completely different had I not done
Mhm.
that journey. Completely different. Who knows what I would have ended up doing, but I think whether it's travel or just opening yourself up to something other than school,
Mhm.
um, travel is in some ways the best way to do that. But just get your eyes up from your notebooks and your computer and so on, and look around and be open to what's coming, what comes your way.
And even like what you were talking about, like in terms of like knowing the language and knowing the culture, like I remember reading this quote and it was like, you're reading a bad history book if all of the sources are in English and it's about a foreign country.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, and it is a telltale sign. I mean, one of the reasons people don't do serious history is precisely that it requires, an extra effort in order to learn language. In the case of Indonesia, I mean, if I had been really diligent, I would have learned 130 languages because that's about how many languages are spoken there. But luckily, the nationalist movement created a lingua franca, which was Bahasa Indonesia. So most people speak and use Indonesian. But to understand the colonial period, you have to know Dutch because it was colonized by the Dutch for 300 years. So all the documents about that are in the Dutch archive. So anybody working, outside of the U.S. or certain other countries, and if you're in history, you have to learn a language. You have to know at least one, probably more than one language beyond your native language. So yeah.
So, in your recent book, Exposed, you emphasize visual imagery as a tool for historical understanding. How do images change the way we interpret events compared to traditional written narratives?
That's a great question. I, I wouldn't pretend to be a great expert on, theory of visual evidence, but here's my starting point, the starting point of myself and my co-author for that book, Exposed. We noticed that the mass killings, some people say genocide in Indonesia in the mid 60s. Sorry, I'm just gonna turn off my phone here.
Okay.
Is relatively little known. I mean, if we think compared to the Holocaust, compared to Rwanda, compared to what's happening in Gaza, certainly, or Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge, very few people you come across actually know anything about the events of the mid 60s in Indonesia. And in Indonesia itself, the events are very poorly understood. And one of my premises in writing this visual history is that the reason that it's so poorly understood is that we don't have an adequate visual record of it. And so the idea of that book was to put in the public realm as complete, as full, as helpful a collection of visual imagery to help people understand what was going on. Not just a bunch of dead bodies, but all kinds of the politics before, during, and after those events. And so what do I think is why does that matter and how is it different? To get back to your question, I think what happens with visual imagery is that the people, particularly people who are not scholars and don't devote their entire life to deciphering and understanding the meaning of words, find it much easier to grasp what's going on when they see an image. So I mean, that's the most basic level, is that images are more memorable. People see things and then they remember them. But there's more to it than that. And one of the interesting things we found is that a lot of the images that are available and that have been, out there were actually images that were produced by the Indonesian army that was committing the violence. And these images were produced with a purpose in mind, which was to justify and legitimize the things that they were doing to destroy the left. But if one looks at those visual images that were essentially propaganda images in a more critical light, with a proper critical framing, suddenly those images look different and they tell a different story. And so this is the fascinating thing about an image, is that it can be read in multiple ways, depending on how it is framed. And so this is one of the reasons that I love this idea of visual history, is that you can take a picture that was intended as an anti-left, anti-communist propaganda video to justify a genocide, and you look at it a little differently, and you can see it as evidence of a crime against humanity. So I think that's another part of it. And then the final thing that is, I think, combines both of these together, is that our idea here is that the memory, what we call the social memory of the events of 1965-66 in Indonesia, have all these years been shaped by the victors, by the perpetrators of the violence. And it has completely skewed people's understanding of what actually happened. And so our hope is that by exposing these photographs, both the official ones and some unofficial ones, it will be possible to create the foundation for a new kind of memory, that Indonesians themselves will actually look at this book. It's now being translated as I speak into Indonesian. They will look at this book and they will have a foundation on which to question and to rethink the kind of story or narrative that they have been presented throughout the last 50 years or 60 years. And that's really important, especially for the generation of Indonesians who are in the majority now, who never witnessed or experienced it, who only know what they know by what they were taught in high school, in government textbooks, which are filled with lies, not surprisingly. And I'm not saying all high school textbooks are filled with lies, but in Indonesia on this subject, they definitely are.
I guess kind of like bouncing off what we were talking about, like many of the official accounts of the Indonesian mass killings have been distorted or suppressed. So what are the biggest challenges historians face when trying to reconstruct truth in their context?
Gosh, yeah, there are a couple of major obstacles. One of them is, as I've already mentioned, that the vast majority of the population has been fed a narrative of the violence, which is completely untrue. And it's happened in ways that are sometimes shocking, sometimes quite banal. But for example, for about 20 years, between the early 1980s and the late 1990s, every school child, including elementary school children, all the way up through university, had to attend every year a government propaganda film about the events of 65, which portrayed the victims of the violence as the problem. And it's 4.5 hours long, and it's filled with blood and guts. And people who see it, even grown-ups who see it, are so revolted they can hardly look at it. But you have 20 years of school kids who've been brought up on this stuff, who've been, I think, probably traumatized by it, and so who quite naturally have a completely skewed idea of what happened. So that is one problem, is that society, Indonesian society at large, has a kind of has been lied to. It would be, if you think of a parallel, it would be, imagine what our history books would look like if the Nazis had not been defeated, and the story of what happened before and during the World War II were written by Nazis. We would not have the kind of appreciation that we do, I would venture to say. So what are the other problem is that the documents, I mean, something that historians care a lot about are documents, like, primary sources, are hard to come by. The best things that we have are, well, there's two main sources. One is foreign governments kept, good notes of what was happening. They were enthusiastic supporters of the army in wiping out the left. And so there's quite a lot in the US and British and Australian and other European archives that can really at least give you an idea what those embassies knew from their sources. But what's really absent are the Indonesian government and Indonesian army archives. So, in other cases where there's, when you think of what happened in the Soviet, after the fall of the Soviet Union suddenly, or East Germany, the archives of the secret police and so on were opened up, at least for a period. And people could find all kinds of stuff because they were meticulous record keepers. The Indonesian army was not quite so meticulous, and quite a lot of none of the archives have been formally opened. Quite a lot of them have been destroyed. So the kind of internal workings of what happened and who ordered what and what kinds of actions were sanctioned and encouraged, that is not readily available. The good news is that in bits and pieces, people are finding little stashes, little caches of archives in someone's living room. Somebody who worked there and took some documents home, kept them in a drawer, then their son or daughter found them and then put them online. So you're finding these documents are slowly emerging in a very kind of piecemeal fashion, but it's not the kind of research, for example, that you could do if you went to the Library of Congress, or you went to, one of the main presidential libraries where everything's just there, a touch of a button, you can look at any document you like. Doing research in the US and Canada and the Netherlands is the simplest thing in the world. Doing it in a country where you have had decades of an oppressive or repressive regime, a military regime that doesn't want you to know anything, it's a different story.
Before I go on to the next question, I just want to tell you, I take global politics in school.
Yeah.
And my teacher actually lived in Indonesia for 10 years.
Oh, really?
I think he lived around 10 years. And it's just like, I'm just thinking, like, I'm talking to you and I was like, wow, he would just love listening to you.
You can share the interview.
100% share the interview.
Yeah.
So to move on, the events of 1965 to 1968 had major implications for the Cold War. How do you think global politics shaped both the violence itself and how it has been remembered?
Good question. Another good question. So the Cold War was really central to the whole dynamic of the violence in two different ways. One was that internally within Indonesia, you had a government led by a left nationalist president, Sukarno, who began as a kind of non-aligned figure. He was a leader of the non-aligned movement. One of the great meetings of the non-aligned movement was in Bandung, which is in Indonesia. Sukarno, along with Nehru, I'm blanking on everybody's name, Nasser, and various other African leaders were there. And so he began in that way, a kind of we're neither pro-Soviet or nor pro-US. The US immediately regarded that as a communist ruse, that non-alignment was just a cover for being a communist. And over the next 8 or 10 years, the US did everything it could to undermine and weaken and destroy Sukarno because they saw him as a threat, as a communist. And of course, naturally, what happened was Sukarno, who was no fool, he was the leader of the anti-imperialist movement. He had been an anti-imperialist, nationalist figure. He was on trial. He was imprisoned by the Dutch, since he was in high school. He was no idiot, and he began to see that the United States was not friendly. And so he moved increasingly to the left. He he was accepting aid from the Soviets, from the Chinese. He made friends with East Germans, with North Koreans, and he was supportive of North Vietnam during the time of the the Vietnam War. So the Americans were, not too pleased with him. But this is the context. The Cold War context was shaping how Sukarno and how politics, broadly speaking, played out in Indonesia. There was a very strong Communist Party. It was not armed. It was in fact the largest non-governing Communist Party in the world. So, the other big Communist parties in the Soviet Union and China were bigger, but they were governing parties. And this was a non-governing, unarmed, non-violent Communist Party with probably 3 million members, and as many as 20 million people in affiliated organizations, women's, peasants, workers, students organizations. And they were mobilized. They were out on the streets. They were in your face. They were organizing strikes and demonstrations and so on. And a lot of that political activity was shaped by the Cold War. So that's internally, there is a kind of polarization that emerges alongside the polarization of the Cold War. Because in addition to those left-wing parties and organizations, the Communist Party, the PKI, there were more right-wing parties. And it became increasingly polarized. Those parties on the right allied with the army, which was supported and encouraged by the United States and its allies. So that's the broad Cold War context. The more immediate context was that the US and the UK and other Western allies were so worried about Sukarno that they actually took a number of measures to encourage the army and the right to destroy Sukarno and destroy the PKI. And the measures included various kinds of black propaganda, sending, sort of dealing secretly with the army, telling the army, if you move against the PKI and Sukarno, we won't say anything. So giving assurances of indifference or silence. And so there was very clear efforts on the part of Western governments to encourage the army to take out the PKI. And in 1965, that's what they did. Once the army had begun to move, the only concern of the Western governments was, especially the US, was they weren't moving hard enough against the PKI and against Sukarno. So the US was encouraging them to move harder and faster to destroy the PKI. When the word came that tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people who had done nothing wrong, were being killed, the US decided to keep silent about it. So there was a deliberate policy of silence. It says it in the documents. Our policy on the mass killings in Indonesia has been silence. And in addition to silence, there was the provision of aid to the army, but not to the government. Various kinds of aid and promises of future support. And then there was political cover. There was praise for the army and the distribution of false propaganda about Sukarno and about the left. So there were many layers to the kind of encouragement that was provided. All of this really being shaped by the Cold War, the broader Cold War context, and a kind of hysteria about communism. How did it affect our memory or our understanding of it subsequently? Is also really important and pivotal question, because you ask yourself, well, why don't we know more about this one? Why do we know about certain genocides and not others? Why do we hear a lot about the terrible things the Soviet Union did and China, We hear about the Holocaust for sure. Well, the difference is in this case is that the United States and all of its allies were complicit in the genocide. And so if you're complicit in a genocide, you're not going to talk about it because under the Genocide Convention, complicity in genocide is also a crime. So no sensible government that has been complicit in a genocide is going to want to talk about it. So, and to its shame, neither did the UN. The UN, perhaps because it was dominated by certain powers, never conducted an investigation into this. There has been no international criminal tribunal of any kind. Well, there has been one. It was an informal one organized by human rights activists, but there's been no formal inquiry either internationally or locally. And so, and I think, you know, the simplest explanation of this is that in Indonesia, those who were the perpetrators stayed in power and were in a position to shape the narrative, and those outside who could have called for an inquiry or helped us understand it and remember it had no interest at all in helping anybody remember anything like that. So that is that. I mean, add that to the list of challenges for a historian trying to uncover the truth. The fact that across the board there has been a deliberate silence and silencing of the issue. Whenever it comes up, people just say, "Well, it's old, it's history, everything's different now." But it's not different for the millions of people who were either killed or incarcerated and their families who were then subjected to terrible kinds of discrimination for the rest of their lives.
So in your work, you mentioned the idea of forming new social memories.
Yeah.
What did it take for society to confront and reinterpret a painful past?
Gosh, that's a really tough question. The only thing that I can say about that is that it almost always happens eventually. But it is something that happens. I would say it takes at least a couple, except in very unusual circumstances like Germany and maybe Japan, where things happened, you know, within a generation. The sort of, you know, in Germany, it didn't happen immediately, but within a generation of the end of the war, there was a reckoning and a sense that, oh, you know what, we collectively were responsible for some horrible stuff. Let us remember. And the state becomes involved in acts of remembrance and acts of regret and for asking for forgiveness and so on. In most cases, and I think here of Spain, Argentina, Chile, and some other places, it doesn't happen that quickly. What happens, what is needed, and this is not a well-developed theory, but it's just what I happen to think. You have to wait a couple of generations beyond the events for a new generation to emerge that shows an interest in what happened. And so there's two things there. One is a generational separation, younger people, but the younger people have to be interested in it. And they have to care about it enough to push and push and push and insist on some kind of reckoning. And so in the case of Spain, it took, 40, 45, 50 years for that to happen, seriously. Argentina and Chile, it took at least another, an extra generation. Indonesia is behind. And it's partly for the reasons that I talked about, that all efforts at memory, all attempts to remember have been stymied, and people who do so, who try to bring this up, get attacked and criticized. But I still actually think it's possible, and that's why I think it's worth writing books, and I think it's why it's worth people interviewing their grandmother, and it's why it's worth people making short documentary films with a former political prisoner, because slowly but surely those kinds of memories, those kinds of that information, that new input is the only way that a new generation of people is going to feel motivated to move and to put pressure on the government. And that is the second thing. The second condition is that although mostly the pressure comes from below, right, from grassroots activity, and that is almost in all of these cases, that is what happened as far as I can tell. But at some point, the state itself, the government bodies, has to become involved. Because it's one thing to have a memorial here and a memorial there and a seminar and a teacher who cares. But at some point, as we see in the case of Germany, you need the state to step in and say, okay, we are actually, as a country, going to apologize, and we are going to provide compensation, and we're going to have memorial sites, and we're going to do this every year or every month or however long it takes. So it's the grassroots activity from a new generation together with a state that finally wants to is taking responsibility. And actually, I think of the case in my own country, in Canada, where it has taken many, many years for anybody to come close to recognizing the harm done to Indigenous people in this country. But finally, about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that concluded that a genocide had been committed against Canada's Indigenous population. And there's been a slow but steady progress or process of reconciliation and recognition and memorialization since then, driven initially by grassroots activism, young people and Indigenous people mostly, but then finally taken up by the state. And that combination is the one that I think is the only one that ever is going to work.
In your research, how do you balance academic objectivity with the moral weight of documenting mass violence and human suffering?
That's another good question. So I'm going to start answering that question by saying that when you study and research this kind of issue, that is a constant challenge. And there are people in academia, historians, who believe that it's inappropriate for a historian to take any position at all on moral questions, or on political questions, that in the name of objectivity, one has to keep one's opinions or ideas about morality and so on out of it completely. And I take issue with that, because I actually think that historians have a responsibility which extends beyond objectivity. It's not to say that we shouldn't be objective, but historians have are responsible in another way as well. And so I think it is possible to be objective, but at the same time to make clear what the moral or political or legal issues are that are at stake. What is at stake? To pretend that you don't have a position on genocide or on torture or on rape is a dishonest position. Of course, you must have that. And that's not being ahistorical. It's not being presentist. There's this term, presentism, which is, applying the morals of today to something that happened in the past. That would be arguably true for some kinds of judgments about the past. But when you're talking about something that happened in the 1960s, which involved the murder of innocent people and the rape of women and the torture of people who really had nothing to do with any crime, I think you can't be accused of presentism or unfairly or wrongly in inserting morality or politics into the equation. I guess in my department and among my colleagues, I was a little bit unusual in the sense that I had lived outside of academia before I became a professor. So my work at Amnesty was much more about advocacy, much more about reporting on human rights, obviously, than it was strictly academic work. And what I found in that work is that it is possible in reporting on human rights to be objective, and at the same time to convey the moral and the legal issues that are at stake. In fact, once you lay out something in the clear and precise terms, in some ways the moral and the legal weight of it becomes even clearer than if one overplays the hand. So that's one of the things that I kind of found very interesting about it, the Amnesty work, is that at least back in the day when I was there, I don't know what's happened now, but back in the day, there was a strict kind of rule that one didn't use inflated language, that one kept the language as flat and neutral and objective as possible and allow the facts to speak for themselves. And there is, of course, the facts never completely speak for themselves. There's always some kind of editorializing that goes on, and that's true in a human rights report as it is in history. But I think there's a lesson there that it's not necessary to kind of go overboard with the adjectives in order to convey the moral or legal or political significance of some historical event. I'm not sure that answered the question, but that's where I am on that issue.
So it's a really interesting answer. We just finished a human rights unit, and we talked a lot about like cultural relativism, and we had like those debates and discussions in class. So like perspective is really like enlightening, and it's very interesting like what actual professionals in the field think about like, oh, cultural relativism versus like human rights being applied to like all times, all different cultures. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah. That's a whole different conversation, but I'm happy to have that one some other day.
Yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was slightly related, but
yeah, no, I mean, my simple answer to that sort of, oh, you human rights people, you're imposing your values on others, and these are just Western values and so on. You have to, be attentive to other people's values. But my answer to that is, if you've ever spoken to the wife or the daughter or the husband of someone who's been tortured or executed without a trial or incarcerated for 14 years without any kind of charge against them, you will find that their idea of human rights is very much the same as mine, which is they think it's wrong and they suffered because of it. And so it has nothing to do with whether I'm Indonesian or Burmese or Canadian. So I think there's a lot of theoretical, sort of theorizing about, one has to be careful about other people's cultures, but there aren't cultures which openly agree that torture, rape, and unlawful execution are okay. Everybody can agree on those. So, and I find that the arguments that have been put challenging the universality claim. Back in the 80s, there was a huge debate about this, the Asian values argument. But it was put mostly by authoritarian governments like Indonesia's Suharto, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, so and the Chinese government. So the worst abusers of human rights were the ones who were arguing that we have to be more sensitive and that human rights are not universal. So anyway, that's my spiel. I'm going to stop on that now.
Yeah, I like your perspective on that. And it's not like, oh, certain cultures are doing the torture and like other cultures have not done it. It's not like as if this is unique to this one culture, because you can see Americans doing torture too, and them thinking that.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like them making the case that, oh, Americans, it's an American culture that torture is normalized just because we've tortured criminals before, and you can't make that argument. Similarly, you can't make the argument in the other case.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So for students interested in history, human rights, or international relations, what skills or perspectives are most important to develop?
Perspectives. Okay, well, here it's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, because having just said that, human rights are universal and so on. I actually think it's vital to develop a capacity and a willingness and openness to understand the cultural and linguistic and political context that you're thinking about. You cannot jump in, and this is where I part ways with political scientists. I'm trained as a political scientist, but I became a historian partly for this reason, is that in political science, in certain iterations of political science, there's a desire to sort of flatten and compare and simplify. That, the most parsimonious, the simplest explanation is the best. And what this does is to sort of make it sound like, well, all countries in this category can be expected to behave the same way. And so there's the search for these this sometimes comparison of 50 different countries, which according to certain kinds of statistical similarities, what their GDP is, or what the nature of their government is, has a way of flattening our understanding and simplifying to the point of meaninglessness what's going on. So I think anybody who's interested in history, certainly, but also in politics and international relations, a willingness to delve in deeply into the history and the culture of the countries that you're talking about. Don't be tempted into broad generalizations before you know something. Once you know something about a country or several countries, by all means, try to compare and contrast and generalize. But you cannot do that unless you really, really delve deeply into the culture and the language of the place that you're studying. I would say that the other, and here, just a side note on language, I think probably one of the most important things you can do is know the language. We talked about this earlier, know the language, or at least one of the languages of the countries that you're studying. If you don't, forget it. I mean, forget about it as a historian, but also forget about it if you're interested in politics, because you're not going to, you're going to get a very partial understanding of what's going on by reading only the English language version of, that appears in the New York Times or whatever. Other perspectives, I guess the other one, which I think, and this is probably the last that I think is really important, is to open your eyes up and open your ears to people who live on the margins of any society or any culture. If you only talk to leaders, if you only talk to political party leaders or ministers or the imam of a particular mosque or the pastor in such and such a church, you will get a very particular kind of perspective, and it will be a limited one. It will be limited because it is a perspective of members of a political and social and economic elite. And that's, if you're interested in that, that's fine. But if you really want to know in all its richness, what's happening in a country, you got to talk to the people at the margins. And so that means if it's a patriarchal society, you have to talk to women. If it's a very class-riven society, you have to speak to working class and unemployed. And if it's a country like the U.S., which is racially divided, you have to speak to people who are people of color. But the broad principle is speak to those at the margins, not only to those at the center. And I think that it turns out that, that's also a lot more interesting. You don't just get the headlines. I found working in Indonesia, I got tired eventually of speaking to political leaders because they all said the same thing. It was all kind of, forgive me for saying so, it was all BS. It was just, it was this sort of standard narrative. And then you talk to ordinary people and they say the most surprising things that don't at all fit in with the official narrative of what the country or what the culture is all about.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's I'm done.
Yeah, so I guess like you were kind of talking about how the narrative and how like it can shift depending on who you're talking to. So if you could change one thing about history and how it's taught, especially regarding like difficult or controversial events, what would that be?
I think it may just be that we be more systematic and more attentive to the voices of survivors, and less attentive, pay less attention to the grand narratives that are voiced by perpetrators and by those who are seeking to justify their actions. So, I mean, you see I guess, in some ways, um, we're finally seeing more of this in news coverage. The news attempts to speak to people who have, in Gaza, or if they can get in there, or in other places, and to say, well, what's happening to people in these camps, or what's happening to people in the West Bank, what's happening in South Sudan. But overwhelmingly, what we hear about is Trump, Netanyahu, Trump, Netanyahu, Trump, Netanyahu, and then maybe Keir Starmer, and then maybe Mark Carney makes a speech at Davos, and everybody talks about him for 3 days. But I think that that's the news. But it's also, unfortunately, quite common in academia that, although certainly it's better now than it was 30 years ago, but there is still this tendency to talk about the big picture, and I think historians are better at it than some other disciplines. Anthropologists are better at it, but get really down to finding out what is the story that everyday people can tell you. And the reason that this is a problem is that, for academics in certain fields, and if you want to get published and so on, you got to make the case that this story about these 6 people who live in a village somewhere matters, that it tells a big enough story. And so the challenge is to take those accounts of everyday people, like real people who have emotions and have personalities and struggles, and weave them into a bigger narrative. So I would just like to see a more systematic and more honest attempt to put those two things together: the big narrative with the sort of everyday people. Oh, and wait, I have one more thing, which is that and this is unpopular, and now I'm actually retired, so I'm professor emeritus. I can say whatever I want, but I actually have always felt that academics, including those who work in this field, need to do a better job of writing their books in a way that people want to read them, or can read them. I think that, unfortunately, there's a tendency in academia to write for other academics only. And I've always tried to write books that I think, I have my dad and my mom in my mind. If my mom and my dad would find this confusing and boring, then I haven't done my job. And so, you get drawn, as you get further and further into academic life, you get drawn into a kind of an idea that you've got to be write in very sophisticated ways and complicated ways, and fill your page with theoretical, underpinnings, and losing sight of the fact that part of your job as a scholar is to inform a wider audience.
I like that. So like you've talked about like throughout this interview, like how like you've kind of taken like alternative paths, and like in your spaces that you've been in, like with your peers, you've kind of had different backgrounds, like with the professors, like you worked at Amnesty International, and you've had like a different perspective than like the average political scientist. So do you think there's a moment or discovery that significantly changed about how you think about history, just looking at your career?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I think I probably had a pretty conventional idea of history and what I should be doing when I was an undergraduate. I think um, the one thing that I got from being an undergraduate in the 70s, I'm really dating myself, but in the 70s, at least at McGill, it was a time when there was a lot of critical thinking about imperialism and colonialism and all these things. And I was always steeped in a very kind of critical way of thinking about existing structures, about multinationals, about big powers, and colonialism and so on. So that prepared me a little bit, but I think it was probably again going to travel to other places and realizing there's a whole world out there that I knew nothing about. That was a kind of, the penny dropped. I was like, oh, the world is not like Canada. However critical and edgy I thought I was, I didn't have a clue. Really, I didn't have a clue. And I so much didn't have a clue that when I was in Indonesia, I thought it was paradise. And it was only later that I realized that and also I went to Burma and thought it was paradise. And in both cases, these places were under the thumb of military dictatorships. And I didn't even see it. I didn't see it. And so that I think it was that experience of being, blown away by the beauty and so on. And then when I started my doctoral studies, realizing, oh, wait a second, I missed this. I completely missed it. In one sense, yes, going there was an eye opener. I saw all kinds of things but it wasn't until I started really delving in and doing my doctoral research that I realized how much I had missed and how easy it is to miss it and how easy it is to be misled by like what you see on the surface. I guess, I don't know if there was a pivotal moment, but I suppose I suppose the experience of being in unfamiliar places was the most formative, even if it didn't completely, it shaped what I think and what I do and what I decided to do, but it didn't come to fruition until a couple of years later when I realized how much I didn't know.
And lastly, like this is the question that we ask everybody we interview, but what does success mean to you?
I hadn't thought about that one. I would say that that I'm going to give the simplest possible answer, but I think success, at least professional success, which I'll separate from other kinds of success, is, in my view, is doing doing research on a subject that matters, and for a larger number of people, not just for me, research on a subject that is significant and that matters and that reaches as wide a readership or population as possible. I think success does not mean winning an academic award or getting promoted or anything like that. It's did I do serious research and did it reach a wider audience? And so to the extent that my work does that, then I feel that was a success. Success outside of that is a completely different topic, but success in your family life is having one. And yeah, that's probably not worth pursuing that particular angle, but I think the professional success one, we can leave it at that.